Donc 20 minutes, je peux revenir à 5 et à 3.
Ok. Je sais pas dépasser. C'est pas dit. I'm going to speak in English for this, so I hope that's okay with everybody. First of all, thank you. I mean, thanks goes out to Juliet and Christina. I recently worked for a network myself, and I know how tough this is. So this has been going great. And again, sorry I couldn't make it last year, but I'm really looking forward to the rest of these 2 days. I'm going to try not to read too much, but I have a 9-month-old daughter, and it's like living in a perpetual jet lag. So I've not been able to go through this text as much as I would have liked. So bear with me. My point, as you'll see, is that it is vital to rethink banlieue spaces, and I'm going to use this terminology, banlieue spaces, in order to be as inclusive as possible of places that are actually not banlieues, housing estates or cités that are located within urban areas while they're positioned somehow outside and imagined to be distinct communes. This is the case for my case study, as you'll see. So my point then is to rethink banlieue spaces as places that one can feel a sense of belonging to. And this can, for anyone who's happy enough to read the media or to listen to the depictions of politicians, be quite surprising. One could think, surely given the chance to, residents would actively desire to leave these places. My feeling is that territorial stigmatization, as it's being conceptualized by people like Loïc Vacan, can be said to further the idea according to which people will want to exit neighborhoods that have bad press. It's not my intention to downplay the material consequences of the blemish of place, as he calls it. On the contrary, I spent my whole thesis highlighting them, and they are numerous and pervasive. Notwithstanding, I found that in the face of these consequences, a number of residents still developed important attachments to the neighborhoods, and it's their voices that I want to talk about today. And I should also state that this is a project that now is a new research project, and I'm working on this with Andreas Tigedra from the University of Nuremberg in Germany. So let me just take you, how does this move? Let me just tell you a little bit more about my research field sites. So from 2009 to 2011, I spent several months in and around the southern French city of Nîmes, and in particular in 2 of its housing estates. There are 4 of them located within the city. This is Val-de-Gour, and here is Pisevin on a market day. They're separated by a large highway called the Avenue Kennedy, but they essentially face each other. And you'll see a slide in a minute which will maybe sort of give visualization to this. They were designed as one by their architect, a very Le Corbusian man called Xavier Arsène-Henri, and the highway was inserted in later plans, which really gives the idea that you now have 2 very separate housing estates facing each other. Pisevin is the larger of the 2 estates with 12,000 people, and Val-de-Gour has a steady decreasing population now, from 5,500 to about now 5,500. It used to have 7,000 before the application of the large-scale urban renovation projects that were launched under the aegis of the Agence Nationale pour la Rénovation Urbaine, in partnership, of course, with the city of Nîmes and the region. Altogether, Pisevin and Val-de-Gour represent about 15% of the population of Nîmes, and if you add the other 2 housing estates, it's 25% of the city, approximately 150,000. So a lot can be said about these 2 estates, but to sum up, they have been increasingly stigmatized over the last decades, even though they were originally hailed, like many of these housing estates, as hypermodern constructions, and as providing far more adequate housing than you would have found in the rest of Nîmes, at a time where much of Nîmes was pretty dilapidated, and it wasn't uncommon, for example, to have to share a communal toilet. But as I stress, what is really important is that they are located within the city of Nîmes, and often, we've been talking about the banlieues extensively, but these are imagined to be part of the banlieue, whereas they are, very part of this city fabric, although they're imagined to be very much outside it. Along with 2 further housing estates that I mentioned, Pisevin and Val-de-Gour have become, to use the expression of Mustapha Dikech, the objects of intervention of the politique de la ville. Edward mentioned the fact that the French are very fond of acronyms. There are a few that attach themselves to these areas, ZAC, ZUP in the past. I'm going to inundate you with a couple of quotes, I'm sorry, but I spoke with several senior officers in charge of urban renovation and with civil servants working for the town hall, mayoral assistants in charge of urbanisme and sécurité. And because I wasn't here last year, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the view from outside, a tiny little bit. So this is this is a quote from a man who's in charge of enacting one of the contracts in line with the renovation. He told me that they should have torn them all down to the ground. Il fallait tout raser. It is an immense enterprise that needs to be managed on the spot if you want to bring a better life to the residents. Another man working on the regional council in charge of urban renovation says the same thing in many more words. He says, we're faced with people who have no hope. For them, the only solution is to be moved elsewhere. So yes, we advocate further demolition insofar as it leads to necessary population dispersal. And then he blathers on about the fact that if you live in a rundown apartment and that your role models are neighbors that are unemployed, that their children are not interested in school, this can't be good for you. And he responds that renovation can work in some cases, but if we're truly going to help these people, then we need to move them out of the neighborhood for good. Only then will they be able to experience hope again. So, yeah, this is a document from the City Council in partnership with the Groupe Réflexe, and you can see Pisevin has been cut up into little areas, with the red meaning very serious problems and the green areas that should be maintained. In this little slide you can see here that in red are the buildings that are considered to be particularly problematic, les points noirs, and it's no surprise for you that these, if and when Nîmes would require more funds for further renovation and demolition, then these would be the first to go. This was confirmed to me by the mayoral delegate in urbanism, and it was also confirmed by François Lamy, who until a couple of days ago was the delegate minister in charge of the city, who spoke about this in the Midi Libre, the regional daily. Here you see Pisevin and Val-de-Bourg as they appear, but this is a very stylized vision. This is a publication in the Fédération Nationale des HLM. You can see Val-de-Bourg is portrayed here as a citadel, labyrinth. I can show you that the star is not part of the actual architecture, it's just supposed to sort of attract our attention and adding to a sort of feeling of threat, I suppose. Worryingly, Pisevin and Val-de-Bourg also began to attract national attention on the media level, and Val-de-Bourg in particular has been highlighted as being, I quote, a strong breeding ground for crime and Islamism in the national left-wing daily Libération in 2012. The article actually continues to describe an esplanade of concrete and dusty grassed areas, often silence is overpowering. Diversity among nationalities is inexistent. The population is almost exclusively from the Maghreb. Pisevin and Val-de-Bourg were also the topic of a pseudo-documentary on the evening TV show Appel d'urgence in 2010. And it was given this very witty, intelligent title of Nîmes, flics sous pression, délinquants prêts à tout. And Carole Rousseau, the presenter, opens the show by saying, assault, mugging, burglary, incivility. Nîmes illustrates all the words that regularly make the headlines. This delinquency takes place in and emanates principally from Nîmes' sensitive neighborhoods, but has also begun to spread out and affect the city center and a number of smaller municipalities that had until then been relatively spared. So you have this whole idea of contagion. And interestingly enough, the next day, one of the mayoral advocates was on another TV show on channel Arte, France 5, saying that Val-de-Bourg, ce n'est pas Nîmes. So, as you can imagine, this has profound impacts on the way that non-estate residents perceive these neighborhoods, and one man told me that he considered these to be eyesores on the horizon, for instance. Now, very, very briefly, I know we've all read Vacon, I suppose, just very briefly to go back to where he gets his territorial stigmatization from. So obviously, Goffman was the first to, well, not the first, but he writes one of the most comprehensive accounts of stigma in '63, where he described stigmatized people as a category of people who are pejoratively regarded by the broader society. They are devalued, shunned, and this has profound effects on their life chances. And so he has these three typologies of stigma, which Vacon says he's very surprised not to see territorial stigmatization in that list, the blemish of place. Now, what is particularly important to Vacon is that although they were created outside the stigmatized neighborhood, negative representations of place trickle down into these spaces, affecting the sense of self of residents, affecting their capacity for collective action, and affecting their relationships with each other, and that's fundamental. In La Courneuve, that I think some of you visited last year, he interviewed a number of civil servants in charge of urban policy, and this is what he says. But because I'm going to run short of time, I will just skip down to the end. Essentially, he says that the civil servants feel disgust at having to take care of certain areas, and then he says, this last sentence there, then I found the same feeling of disgust and indignity at the very bottom of the urban ladder among the residents of the 4 Communes housing project. So of course, Vacon, just importantly, Vacon concludes that this internalization of negative imagery by residents of stigmatized places is one of the most conclusive results of his research. And he's been influenced, or he worked in tandem with this idea of territorial stigmatization with his mentor Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote it in 1993 of site effects, dispossession, neighborhoods that are, he says, bringing together on a single site population homogeneous in its dispossession strengthens that dispossession. This is a phrase from Bourdieu. I think that both sociologists are, sorry about that, both sociologists are right to point to the extreme material consequences of territorial stigmatization, but it's my belief that their analyses are slightly overly deterministic when it comes to embodying or internalizing stigmatization by residents. The fact is that there are actually very few voices from below, some of these unheard voices that Juliet was talking about in Vacan's conceptualizations. Now, briefly, I just want to talk about because it's in my title, and most of my PhD was concerned with the strategies of resistance or coping or challenging stigma that residents enact. And of course, there are organizations. There are a number of, there are actually 2 neighborhood committees that operate within these neighborhood committees in Banlieue, and they work together. Their members have tried to be as inclusive as possible, so they say, and they found representatives of major age groups as well as ethnic groups. The committees strive to paint a portrait of housing estates as neighborhoods in their own right, and although one has to ask who these committees speak for, they've enabled some to get a foot in the door so as to represent cité residents. In fact, they try to be more inclusive when it comes to collective decision-making than the town hall would otherwise allow. And I think these are kind of, these groups work in ways that Michel Kovarev has studied when he talks about the politique des quartiers, and they come along with the associations and all of these groups. But although I looked attentively at this organized resistance, my PhD has focused on more discrete, some would say mundane acts of resistance, and we can debate whether the word is resistance, is a big question. But certainly ways of negotiating stigma. The literary theorist Bell Hooks actually describes wonderfully how marginality can be a great starting point to resistance, and this is one of the things that I looked at. And there's an article about that which is set to be published in June in Environmental Planning 8. I urge you all to read it. It's fascinating. By me, of course. So if you turn to this superbly crafted graph that I've done, I think you'll admit to that. On the left you can see this kind of Bourdieu-Vacan strategies of self-preservation that they describe. And on the right are the sort of more resistive strategies that I came across in my own research, and to use the language of Michel de Certeau that we've been talking about quite a lot today, we talk about tactics, which are very, very short, and the kind of weapons of the weak. So of course it is the case that residents react in the ways, that some residents react in the ways that Vacan describes, and in numerous cases I came across respondents who withdrew into the domestic space so as to avoid spending too much time in the neighborhood that they thought to be slightly dangerous. But in fact, it has to be said that they were very regularly people who had arrived relatively recently in either Pisan or Val-de-Gour. Sometimes they had a relatively poor command of French because they moved in from another country. And they were people who had not, I would say, developed a network of friends and acquaintances. So what Vacan ignored, perhaps because he wasn't looking for it, is that residents could also react in ways that allow them to resist or challenge the stigma. We talked about agency earlier on with Bruno. Where is their agency in his accounts? I had several respondents who were totally indifferent to the language of stigma that they knew existed, but they thought it didn't really affect their lives. They tended to be slightly older and not too worried about employment or traveling to the rest of the city for certain activities, so to say, like nightclubs or cinema. Others were very defensive and asserted the fact that their neighborhood had several positive characteristics that they then listed for me. Another interesting thing was the kind of linguistic appropriation of technocratic language. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the acronym ZUP, Urbanization Priority Zone, and people would say, je viens de la ZUP, je suis ZUPéen. There was also this appropriation of hyperbolic representations of their place of residence, je viens du ghetto. And I think Vacan would say to this that this is a result of internalization, and why not? But it can also be imagined as a way of speaking back. I think this comes with the appropriation of urban spaces. So the neighborhoods of Pisan and Val-de-Gour are regularly occupied, certainly, by a number of groups of people, from the elderly chatting or playing pétanque, to the youth who hang out and to the outside are obviously doing something rather suspicious in doing so. And I think it is notable that these are spaces that are frightening to many, if not all, people who have not ever been into them. So to imagine that they can be occupied in these ways can be surprising. Obviously, my list here is not exhaustive, but I was particularly interested to come across the production of counter-narratives, or across people who would re-script the neighborhoods in very different light to what I expected, I suppose. And of course, it's these narratives, these different versions of the story that enable the attachments to Pisan and Val-de-Gour in some way. So when the demolition of apparently ugly, dilapidated housing estates is upheld as a positive for urban areas, for the residents of Nîmes as a whole, for the marketing of Nîmes, and for the residents of these places themselves, it may be surprising to hear the voices of those who somehow managed to become attached to these demonized spaces, notwithstanding the importance of the prevailing discourses. And it's to these voices that I turn, but first, let me insist upon the fact that my research findings don't stand alone in a vacuum. Don't stand alone in a vacuum. I think it's important to point to the fact that since I began my research back in 2008, a series of articles have been released stating that either residents of stigmatized neighborhoods had more ambivalent relations to their place of residence, or that they were unaffected by it and produced counter-discursive narratives that focus on the positives of the places in which they live. And of course, so these are the three articles that I recommend. I think they're really useful to know that they're out there, because it sort of gives more force to the argument according to which residents need to be further included in participation processes, we come to this again, regarding their homes and neighborhoods, and not just in a homeopathic sense. Now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to read a quote from the Journal de Val-de-Bourg, which is a local newsletter whose offices have taken over one of the abandoned ground floor apartments in a block in Val-de-Bourg. And this is taken from a short article entitled Démolition and written by a local resident, Atman. He says, "It has started. The Galilée block is said to be demolished. After the Newton block, the Jean Perrin tower, the Archimède block, the bridge to Archimède Street, the fallen stones are as many memories from my childhood that crumble and break like those sad bits of concrete. Soon Galilée will be gone, and a large emptiness will take its place, aerating a neighborhood that the city wishes to see less dense. And this emptiness will drown my heart for many years to come. It is between the warm and comforting walls of a spacious apartment in Galilée that my life began. The image of this building remains one of the most beautiful in my childhood memories. I now understand better the expression, things were better before." I think this nostalgic plea for what once was can be contrasted to the words of the urban officials that I mentioned before. Again, those suggested that renovation may not have been sufficient exercise, and that only through further demolition could the neighborhoods go through effective change. Now, I'll quickly, in total, I conducted just under 50 interviews with residents, and it's only towards the end of my research that I started to meet people who had been displaced. So as a result, I know that these findings are not statistically relevant in any strong sense, which is why I pointed to the other articles to support my claims. I'm now doing further interviews with these people. So the displaced were often profoundly affected by their forced move. They spoke of frustration and not having been properly consulted before, during, and after. Some speak of the better conditions that they had in their old apartments, and this is particularly the case for those who were relocated from Val-de-Bourg into Pisan in blocks of flats that, given the opportunity, the city of Nîmes will no doubt demolish at some point. One man was in the Midi Libre, the regional daily that I mentioned before, was shown as having gone on hunger strike to have his family moved out of his new flat in Pisan. A number of people insisted on the fact that, having paid rent to the HLM organizations that manage most of the estate apartments, they should have been more involved in taking decisions about where they should be relocated. I think the lack of respect, the lack of recognition, all are issues that the removed residents discuss with disgust. The move has in several cases ended up rupturing a number of social networks. Not all residents have the money to own a car, and the bus is not always the most efficient way of linking neighborhoods in Nîmes. Questions of transport again that Alex was just talking about. Having to readapt to an already difficult life elsewhere has taken its toll on a number of respondents, who, according to two social workers that I interviewed, now spend much more time seeking help, more time worrying about the future. There are very legitimate worries about people's health, about the fact that being moved might in fact lead to furthering the already difficult life chances of residents. And now I have two quotes that I'd like to be able to read in full if I can. The first is from Fatima, a long-term resident of Val-de-Bourg who was moved to Pisan, and she says, "When I tell you that there's zero respect for us, listen, they come here, they say, be happy, we have the funds to renovate." So you say, cool. But then they turn up with the bulldozers. Wait a minute, do you understand that? They say, we'll make your neighborhood nicer, and then they expect you to move away. So I think they took the piss out of us. It wasn't about the renovation, making the neighborhood nicer, etc., etc. It was about moving us to make the neighborhood nicer. The worst for everyone, I can tell you, is that they thought these people are idiots, they don't know what we're up to, it has really made us mad. Now Fatima is aware that there could have been beneficial renovations to her building. Certainly not all the buildings in Banlieue are in perfect condition, that certainly would be wrong to state. But she does realize that she was never supposed to be part of the decision-making process, and this leaves her feeling that she's been taken for a fool, that she's been infantilized by the decision-maker. Sonia, did I? Okay, sorry. The demolition, so Sonia is also a resident of Edinburgh, and she says that the demolitions of the towers are clearly demeaning. They tell you what will happen without engaging you. I remember that I lived in Archimed Tower for 16 years. I played in all those corridors. We hid from the parents and the police at the passageway. It was our building. We had made it our building. We were pretty naughty, but we were young and a bit silly. I had cousins who got moved out when they had to pull it down. They had lived there longer than me and my parents, and they were devastated. Okay, they knew the building had its bad sides, but it was part of them in a way, Archimed and Banlieue. Well, they, and she refers to urban policymakers or the town hall, don't want you to feel like you should take part in the decision making anyway. It's frustrating. She adds that her displaced cousins are finding it very hard to keep up with things in their new home. They're looked upon suspiciously by their neighbours. Their children have found it hard to connect with the children in the new school, which leads to the parents' feelings that they can't control the destiny of their own children. And I'm coming up to the conclusion, so I just want to say that in a moving text in 1963, Mark Freed, a professor at Boston College, had already warned of the psychological cost of relocation for swathes of residents from Boston's West End in the early 60s. And from my interview with residents who've seen their neighborhood change quite drastically, and with those who live with the uncertainty of where they might have to live tomorrow, suggests that there is a strong anxiety linked to displacement, and a real sadness in many who see what was once their home bulldozed to the ground under the assumption that this will benefit everyone. And I hope I've made it clear that those who were displaced undergo massive stress, that they feel left out of decision processes, and that, in the words of Mark Freed, they continue to grieve for a lost home. My feeling is that territorial stigmatization has one insidious consequence that needs to be developed, and that is the legitimization of demolishing the solution for cleaning up the mess, if you use a bad expression. If, as academics, we fail to illustrate, pick up on, and give voice to those who feel quite at home in those neighborhoods of deprivation, or those urban hellholes described by Vacan, we give further legitimacy to these policies. Again, not my purpose to state that other than displacement, territorial stigma has little or no consequences. The material consequences are there, and they're well documented. So I think perhaps you've had time to read this list. I will skip it, but I will tell you that this list is of course non-exhaustive. I just want to come back to my title, very, very briefly, in one short paragraph, just to say that I playfully entitled this talk, The Right to the Cité, but I should have called it The Right to Stay Put in the Cité, and a right to make and remake the cité. The right to the city is an elusive concept at best. What we can say is that the right to the city was not for Henri Lefebvre simply about better housing. I know that I'm looking at a very narrow version of the right to the city here, and to borrow the expression of Marcelo Lopez de Souza, I'm looking at the tree and not the forest. But the forest is made out of trees, and I think that at the very least, the right to the city translates into redistributive policies against segregation and for affordable housing, transit, and other public services. So the voices of those residents with whom I spoke in Nîmes stress that this would not be merely a homeopathic solution. They should, they think, have the right to participate, to remake the city and to choose where they live. I think I could have given you a 20-second talk if I just said that a number of residents in so-called banlieues like where they live, so apologies for taking so long to get here.